In this lesson, I'll introduce the idea of a propositional connective. These are one way we can combine propositions together to make new propositions. One way to think about this is to think of propositional connectives as glue. Now, here are 4 individual propositions, which you might hear in Melbourne rather a lot. It's raining, I don't have my umbrella, I'll get wet, I'm lucky. Now, these statements can not only stand on their own, they can also be used as components inside larger statements. So, for example, I can conjoin the first 2 statements with an and get a larger statement that says both. It's raining and I don't have my umbrella. I could join the last 2 statements with an unless and say I'll get wet unless I'm lucky. And then I could wrap these 2 statements together in an if-then to get a much larger statement that combines all 4. If it's raining and I don't have my umbrella, then I'll get wet unless I'm lucky. This sentence has got 3 logical connectives in it: the and, the unless, and the if-then. And actually, if you look closely inside here, you'll see another logical notion, the N''T, in the don't. That's short for do not. The not converts the I do have my umbrella into its opposite, I don't have my umbrella. And this not is also important for logic, so we're going to put it in the same basket as the other connectives, even though it doesn't actually connect propositions together. So these connectives, coloured in red, tell us something important about the shape or form of this large, complex statement. And other propositions have the same form. So, for example, if I strike the match and it isn't wet, then it will light unless it's in a vacuum. If you look, you'll notice this has exactly the same shape as the other statement, but it has a different content. It's about different things. Or, if n is greater than 5 and m isn't even, then f applied to m and n is greater than 5 unless m equals n. This is a complex mathematical proposition which also has the same form. So we've seen that connectives join propositions to make new propositions. And whatever those propositions are about, whether it's the weather, striking matches, mathematics, or anything else, using these connectives doesn't switch the topic over to something else, but they give us ways to say more complex things about whatever it is that we're talking about. So, in this lesson, we're going to look at these different sorts of connectives. We'll start with conjunction. Now, given any 2 propositions, like it's raining and I don't have my umbrella, we can assert both of them in one proposition by asserting their conjunction. It's raining and I don't have my umbrella. And in general, for any 2 propositions, P and Q, we'll write P and Q with an ampersand for their conjunction, and we'll call the P and the Q conjuncts of that conjunction. So, it's important to understand that not every use of and in a sentence forms a conjunction. Let's take a look at some examples and identify which of the following sentences express conjunctions. The easiest way to do this is to try and identify what the conjuncts of the conjunction would be and see if you can get the original sentence back if you stick those conjuncts together. So, for example, I might say, Clancy is tired and Madison has a headache. This is clearly a conjunction. The conjuncts are Clancy is tired and Madison has a headache. And if you stick those 2 things back together with an and, you'll get the original sentence back. There's no problem with this case. An interesting case is this. I learned logic and I never regretted it. Here, the first conjunct is I learned logic, and that is indeed a proposition. That's fine. The second is more complex. I never regretted it only makes sense in context. Were I to take this sentence out of context, I'd have to say something more specific, like I never regretted learning logic. And that's fine. This sentence is the conjunction between I learned logic and I never regretted learning logic. Now let's look at another sentence involving an and, like Lee and Darcy are lovers. This is not a conjunction in our sense, as you can see when you try and ask what the first conjunct might be. I mean, it's not just Lee, that doesn't make a sentence. But you might say Lee is a lover and Darcy is a lover. But those two things can be true without Lee and Darcy being lovers in the usual sense we mean when we say that they love each other. If that's what you mean when you say Lee and Darcy are lovers, that and doesn't just conjoin two statements, but it says something more specific. Similarly, if I say I went out and had dinner, if that's just the conjunction of I went out and I had dinner, then we'd simply be saying that those two statements were true. But typically, when we say something with an and of this form, we're saying something about the order in which they came to be true. We're saying that I went out and then I had dinner after that while I was out. If I had dinner at home and then went out after that, it will be very deceptive to say I went out and had dinner, even though I went out and I had dinner are both literally speaking true. An and, which has the meaning of and then, isn't really a conjunction in the sense that we're talking about. Now, my favourite example of an and that isn't a conjunction is this: one false move and I shoot. You can picture someone saying this while holding up a bank. There, the bank robber is not both saying one false move and I shoot are both true. What they're saying is really, if you make one false move, then they'll shoot. And that's a very different sort of connection between the two statements than a conjunction. So, let's check up with how you're going. Take a look at this list of 5 sentences and figure out which of these express conjunctions of two propositions and which of them don't. How did you go? If you've got questions or comments about your answers to these questions, or if you'd like to explore the issues further, take a look at the course notes for this section and head into the discussion boards and follow things up. I'll take a look and see how you're going. Now, conjunction is just one of the connectives. Another one is disjunction. We could assert that at least one of two propositions is true by asserting their disjunction. I'll get wet or I'm lucky. Now, when we make an or statement like this, we could interpret it as inclusive, including the option that both turn out to be true. I'll get wet or I'm lucky, and maybe both. After all, I could get wet in the rain but be lucky because I've met a friend that I've not seen for a long time. Or we could interpret it exclusively, as meaning that I'll get wet or I'm lucky, and both don't happen. In this course, we'll focus on the inclusive reading of disjunction because it's easier to work with and it has a kind of dual relationship with conjunction that we'll see in future. Now, for the propositions P and Q, their inclusive disjunction is written with a V symbol, P vowel Q or P or Q, and the P and the Q parts are called the disjuncts of the disjunction. Now, the V symbol comes from the Latin word vel, which means or. Now, we've seen the word unless. Unless in English acts like a disjunction too. When I say I'll get wet unless I'm lucky, I'm saying that I'll get wet, but then I step back from saying that this is the only thing that could happen by adding the kind of get out clause about being lucky. Another way to say this is to say I'll get wet or I'm lucky. Another case might be, I'll say I'll go to the party unless Clancy is there. I'm saying that I'll go to the party, but I'm accepting the case where Clancy is there. When I say this, what am I saying about what would happen if Clancy were at the party? Am I saying that I'd leave? Or that I might leave? There are some interesting issues around here about how to interpret unless clauses, and whether they're all inclusive or exclusive or a mix of the two cases. Join in the discussion boards if you'd like to follow up this issue. Now, a really important logical connective is the conditional. We can connect up statements by using an if and then. Conditionals are so useful, we've got many different ways of saying them. The most straightforward is the if P then Q form that we have here. If it rains, then I'll get wet. But sometimes we can leave the then out, and we could say if P, Q, and just have a comma. I might say, if it rains, I'll get wet. In fact, sometimes we can say the second part first and say, I'll get wet if it rains. Now, in each of these cases, I'm connecting up the P and the Q and saying the Q happens if the P happens. I'm saying that you can get from the P to the Q. If you learn that P is true, then Q will follow, or that Q holds in the circumstance where P holds. Now, the only if form of a conditional gives us the same sort of information. If I say P only if Q, then if you believe me, and if you learn that P is true, then it follows that Q is true too, because P happens only if Q happens true. So even though it sounds very strange, we could say it rains only if I get wet, and you'd be saying something which has the same effect. If you're out walking and you're not getting wet, then you deduce from that that it's not raining, or at least that it's not raining very much. Notice that sometimes when we say that if P then Q, we think of the P causing the Q. And when we say P only if Q, we often think of the Q causing the P, or being a precondition. The cause and effect relationship can go in either direction in a conditional, but the information direction in each of these cases is from P to Q, because from the conditional if P then Q, or P only if Q, when we learn P, we deduce Q. Or if we find out that Q isn't true, we learn that P isn't true either. Now, another word that you might see for a conditional is implies. You could say that P implies Q when you want to talk about this sort of connection. Now, in each case for the conditional, whatever form it's got, if it's an if P then Q, a Q if P, a P only if Q, or whatever, in any of these forms we say that the P is the antecedent of the conditional, even if it occurs second, and the Q is the consequent of the conditional, even if it occurs first. And the symbol we use for a conditional is probably a new symbol for you. It's a reverse elongated C. Sometimes it's thought of as a horseshoe. That's the conditional, if P then Q. So let's see some examples to help you get this straight in your mind. We'll work through a few example conditional statements. So look at these statements and ask yourself the question, which of these are conditionals? And for them, identify the antecedent and the consequent. Have a look at this one. If I don't do the practice exercises, I won't learn. In this case, it's relatively straightforward. The if part marks the antecedent. I don't do the practice exercises, that's the antecedent. And I won't learn, that's the consequent. On the other hand, we could say, I'll learn if I do the practice exercises. In this case, I do the practice exercises is the antecedent, and the consequent is I'll learn. And you'll notice in this case, the consequent comes up first. Or I might say, I'll get wet if it rains and I don't have an umbrella. In this case, this could either be a conditional, which says, if it rains and I don't have an umbrella as the antecedent, and I'll get wet is the consequent. In that case, it's an if-then statement. But another thing that you could say is that it is an and statement where the first part is I'll get wet if it rains, and the second part, the second conjunct, is the conjunct I don't have an umbrella. In this case, the sentence is ambiguous between two different readings. And we'll say a little bit more about ambiguity in an upcoming lesson. Another statement is I'll get wet only if it rains, and I don't have an umbrella. Again, this is ambiguous between the conditional, I'll get wet, that's the antecedent, and only if marks the conditional, and it rains and I don't have an umbrella is the consequent, or it might be a conjunction where the antecedent, the one conjunct is I'll get wet only if it rains, and the other conjunct is I don't have an umbrella. Another example is this statement here, which says the report implies that 2 million jobs may be lost. In this case, there's some implication going on, but it's not actually a conditional unless you unpack what it is that the report says. If somebody could summarize what the report says and says all of this, if all of this is true, then 2 million jobs may be lost, that would be a conditional. So, There's some examples that I've worked through. Why don't you take a look at these examples that I've got here? I've got two different conditional statements. See if you can spot the antecedent and the consequent in each case. How did you go? Again, if you've got any questions or comments, take a look at the course notes and head into the discussion boards to follow things up. Now we're on the home stretch now. The last connective that we'll look at is the biconditional. Lots of systematic reasoning contains two-way connections between concepts, and we can express these in a biconditional. For example, I might say, I'll get wet if and only if it's raining. P if and only if Q says P happens, then Q happens, and vice versa. If Q happens, so does P. Now we could say this using a combination of the conditional and the conjunction, but that happens so often that we'll use another symbol for it, the tribar or the three-line equality sign. It doesn't mean that P and Q are the same statement, it just means that in some sense they're equivalent. The P and the Q are called the left and right hand expressions of the biconditional. In words, if and only if is often abbreviated as IFF. Now, if and only if was the last connective, but it's not the last logical notion we'll look at. You'll remember we noticed that don't express the denial of do. In general, the basic way of denying a proposition is to assert its negation. If you think that it's wrong to say that smoking is always bad for your health, then you might think that smoking is not always bad for your health. This is the negation of the original proposition. If P is a proposition, we'll write not P, this little squiggly not sign for its negation. And P, the thing that you negated, is said to be the negand of not P. Now, negation is sometimes tricky because we can add the negative components in different places in an expression. So which of the following propositions are negations, and which are their negands? For example, I might say, it's not the case that I've won the London Marathon. That's clearly a negation, and it's the negation of, I have won the London Marathon. Or, that outfit won't cost you $250. That's a negation of, that outfit will cost you $250. A more complex statement is, smoking is never bad for your health. This is clearly a negation, but a negation of what? It's not a negation of smoking is always bad for your health. If I say that smoking is never bad for your health, I'm negating smoking is sometimes bad for your health. And finally, a famous negation is, I am not a crook. Richard Nixon said this to deny the claim that he was a crook. This is the negation of, I am a crook. So take a look at these example propositions for yourself. Which of these things are negations? And of those that are negations, think about what their negands are. Now, how did you go? Take a look in the discussion boards and join in the discussion if you've got any questions. Now, in this subject, they're the logical connectives that we'll be looking at. But there are plenty of other things that make propositions out of new propositions. Don't think that we've looked at the only connectives that there are. For example, when you say Clancy believes that snow is white, that makes a new proposition out of the proposition snow is white. Or it's possible that people might go to the moon again in the next 20 years. That makes a statement out of the statement that people will go to the moon in the next 20 years. Or it's necessary that 2 plus 2 is 4. That modifies the claim that 2 plus 2 is 4. Or because, I get wet because it rains. Each of these things are connectives or modifiers which make new propositions out of old ones. And they're important logical notions. But we're not going to be looking at those in this subject. But in more advanced logic subjects, these come into focus. So that's the end of our lesson on connectives and identifying them. What we're going to do in the next lesson is look at the structures that we're now going to be able to identify. We're going to look at a formal language for describing the forms that propositions can take.